Well, hi again, everyone, and welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. Today, we get a second chance to chat with, or if I really wanted to be spiteful, I'd say we get a second shot at Dr. Wallace Pond. He was on Unstoppable Mindset some time ago, and we had a fascinating discussion, and we talked about him coming back, and he said he would, and he did. Brave man that he is. So here we are, and you can read his biography in the show notes and so on, but he has been in a variety of kinds of situations, came from, as I recall, a military family, and has been in a number of different kinds of job situations. And he can talk about that if he would like to. But Wallace, welcome back to Unstoppable Mindset. I think we're going to have some fun.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm glad that we could do this again. I really enjoyed it the last time.
Anything that you want to talk about before we delve into other things, or?
Well, you and I had talked kind of offline about just the whole concept of leadership and kind of what that means and how it's changing and what elements of leadership seem to be effective or more effective than others as society evolves, as organizations evolve, et cetera. And I thought we might poke around in that for a while and see what comes up.
You said something very interesting when I asked you about that, and you emailed me back. You said that leaders, or a lot of leaders, are moving away from dealing with technical expertise and moving toward relying on the success of others, which I thought was interesting and I thought very refreshing. I think that a lot of leaders that I've known, or people who say they're leaders, regard themselves as being highly technical. And I think there's a lot of value in leaders being very familiar with whatever they're dealing with and being technical in that regard. But that shouldn't be the only thing that makes up a leader. And I think all too often we find that people believe that, which is really the mistake. So when we talk about relying on the success of others and so on, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think there was a time, and by the way, I think an unfortunately low number of leaders are moving that way. I think leaders that are experiencing success are moving that way. But that's how it used to be. It's not surprising if you go back, 25, 30, 40 years. A lot of leadership was about technical expertise in some field, about being directive, about really sort of price of entry, things that may be commodified in leadership today. But it was a much, much less complex environment. The workforces were much more amenable to hierarchy.
Yeah.
Older generations had much greater tolerance for things that didn't make a lot of sense, or that weren't particularly rewarding or weren't connected to purpose. And I think what we're seeing now is that not only have the needs of leadership from a sort of operational and strategic perspective evolved, but we've got a workforce now that's predominantly millennial and Gen Z that just doesn't see work the same way that you and I did earlier on, and that certainly our parents did, and just don't have a lot of patience for stuff that in previous generations we just kind of sucked it up and did.
How so, for example?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. Like, the idea, I think, for older Gen Xers and certainly baby boomers was, you went to work, you put in your time, you did what the boss said, and you were rewarded by that with job security and a decent salary, and there was tremendous respect for hierarchy. You kind of did what the boss said, even if you had a different idea, and you certainly, in those generations, committed to doing a lot of work, whether it made sense to you personally or not. It was just what you were supposed to do. And I think in generations now, millennials and Gen Zers, they're much more skeptical about, dedicating their time, their effort, their energy, their intelligence to things that, just because someone said do this. I think the whole kind of work-life balance has been turned on its head. And I think younger generations really have moved away from that whole notion of living to work and are now more focused on working to live.
Hmm.
Work as a means to an end. It's less, connected to their identity, their sense of success, their validity. Uh, they're also in an era where they just don't get rewarded in the workplace. So if you go back to boomers and older Gen Xers, um, they agreed to do a lot of stuff that didn't feel good or they didn't want to do, but they were rewarded for it. I mean, they had benefits and they had a decent salary and they had much greater job security. You've got lots of younger folks today who are, have far less job security, maybe no benefits at all. What they make versus what they need to live, the gap is substantial. Many of them are now in the gig economy. So, there's no stability at all. No benefits, no sick leave, no, so for them, they've kind of said, what's the calculus here? Uh, does it make sense for me to, work to live or live to work?
Yeah.
And the live to work part, that calculus just doesn't make nearly as much sense.
What do you think has brought that about?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, and I think we could sort of take a political approach or a philosophical approach.
Or
Some,
both?
some people would argue this is sort of a natural state of late stage capitalism, that this is just where it ends up when you have a system where the rewards and the regulatory infrastructure and the access to capital is designed, to support ever increasing profitability and ever increasing wealth for a limited number of folks. When corporations are expected to care more about profits and shareholders than about things like social good. I think that's a reasonable argument, that this is sort of where our system leads to. I think also, at least in the United States, there's sort of an underlying cultural notion of it's mythology, but this idea of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. If you just work hard enough, you will succeed. And in other societies, there's sort of a different value set. I think also, as an underlying cultural reality, things change. The world in which the baby boomers grew up in is a very different world than millennials and Gen Xers have grown up in, and values evolve over time.
Yeah.
And I think it would be really unusual if the system were exactly the same today as it was in 1948, post World War II.
Yeah. I personally, though, have always had a problem with the company that says it's all about profit. Because typically, although I understand how things have changed, companies didn't start out necessarily being all about profit. I'm sure Mark Zuckerberg wanted to make money when he started Facebook, but he also had some social ideas, and he has evolved over time. And there's a lot more to do with profit. And Steve Jobs did the same thing. Bill Gates did the same thing. But Bill Gates, especially now, has adopted more
Right.
of a social attitude. And I think that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but I think that it's a mistake for companies to just take the position it's all about profit. Because if they don't choose to be loyal to people at all, then of course people aren't going to be loyal to them. And where does that take us? That's a spiral I'm not sure is a good place for us to go either.
It's also a potential segue back to the leadership question. But what I would, um, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I think, the profit motive has driven a lot of innovation
Yeah.
and has, resulted in financial opportunity for a lot of people. I think, if we sort of buy into this notion of late stage capitalism, when you have generation after generation, when you have ownership structures of companies that are profit driven, they're shareholder driven, whether it's private equity, whether it's publicly traded, whether it's some other sort of investment structure like venture capital. All of those structures are foundationally built on people spending money and getting way more money back.
Hmm.
That's what that structure is. It's based upon supporting profitability. If you go back to that time I was mentioning, 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, um, there was much less pressure on companies to enrich, to significantly enrich a small number of people at the expense of others. If you look at the difference, the gap in pay between employees and managers and executives, it was a tiny fraction of what
Right.
that gap is today.
Right.
Uh, if you look at the return on investment that venture capitalists or private equity people are looking for, it's astronomical. They don't always get it,
Yeah.
um, but what they're after is astronomical. And so that has to come from somewhere. Those resources, that liquidity has to come from somewhere. And it's leverage, it's debt, or it's eliminating the cost of labor. And from a leadership perspective, I think probably starting in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, there was a leadership focus that sort of saw labor or employees or workers as an expense item on a P&L
Yeah.
versus an asset. Um, Certainly we're not seen as, human beings, as humanity,
Right.
as something, bigger than, say, technology or capital or real estate. And I think what we're seeing now, and I think this kind of ties back in with younger generations of workers, is I think it's getting harder and harder as a leader to effectively run companies, grow companies, sustain companies if they don't have some focus on purpose, on social impact,
Hmm.
on employees as not even employees, but human capital, where human is the important word. Um, and I think for folks who figure that out, there's an incredible ROI because technology is fleeting, it's a commodity. Even capital is a commodity. Real estate is a commodity.
Right.
And I'm not the first to say this, but as a leader, if you want a truly genuine, sustainable competitive advantage, it's going to be in people. It's not going to be in those other commodities. And if it's going to be in people, you know, that's going to come from being able to connect with people and connect them to purpose and to build trust. And, we might use the word loyalty.
Yeah.
The idea that there's something bigger here than just punching a clock. And that applies to both the leader and the employee. So I think we're seeing some changes. I would absolutely agree, Michael, that if all a company cares about is profit, that can work for a while. But it's counter to sustainability.
Yeah. And it will be self-destructive at some point in the long run because people won't have loyalty. And if we don't learn to understand the value of loyalty in that kind of a company, then something's going to happen and that company will go away or be absorbed or whatever,
Yeah, or we'll just start underperforming.
or we'll
You
start
know,
underperforming.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I talk to clients and potential clients, we do work. We talked about this in our last podcast. at the Transformation Collaborative, we support organizations with helping them reinvent themselves, but we also have a really interesting leadership discovery program. We don't even call it leadership development, Michael, because we think that's not the right focus or the right frame of reference. It's really about helping leaders and potential leaders really discover their own capacity as leaders, and help connect them to what matters to them, so that they can connect other people to what matters to them. But one of the things that becomes really evident when we talk to client organizations and potential client organizations, is it's really hard as a leader. It's really hard to stray too far from the status quo. It's really hard to talk about things like, supporting the humanity in organizations when investors, boards have no frame of reference for that language, let alone that language actually leading to sustainability and performance.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example. Like, boards and investors and exec teams, they understand all kinds of things like, projected ROI on an investment in a computer technology, an efficiency move. They get that, and it doesn't have to take much convincing anybody of anything. But the idea that you're going to be more profitable, that you're going to generate more revenue, that you're going to be around longer by investing in employee engagement, that's like, you see, that's deer in the headlights, eyes glaze over.
But aren't there ways, or aren't there companies that we can point to who do behave that way, to show some of these boards, no, take a different look at X, Y, and Z or whatever?
Yeah, there are. There are what we might call prototype organizations, and even structures. A while ago, there was this move by some companies to evolve or to be founded as what's called B Corps or benefit corporations. That did not turn out quite, I think, like people envisioned, because there still tended to be, and all a B Corp did was it gave corporations permission to focus on other areas of benefit other than profit, right?
Right.
That they were legally protected from making decisions. They couldn't be sued by, for example, shareholders for making financial decisions that may have decreased profit, but generated some other really intense important benefit. We thought that was going to maybe be a model that would really work. Hasn't turned out quite the way that people thought it would. I think if we kind of think about potential examples of what I'm talking about, one example is Patagonia. It's a in many ways it's kind of an old-fashioned textile company, but the culture of that company, which came from the founders of that company, is that they are about way more than profits, and they invest resources in the environment. They invest resources in sustainability. They invest resources in their employees. They have incredible employee retention, very low turnover. They little things like you can own a Patagonia, a piece of clothing, for years and years and years, and you can send it back to Patagonia after 20 years and get a credit, and they'll recycle it. The owner of Patagonia has already announced that he is shifting the ownership of the company to employees, and he plans to die poor. That's an extreme but really profound example of what's possible.
Right.
But in order for that to work, it had to be a privately held company, because typical investors won't stand for that, right? Typical investors invest, whether it's stock or whether it's venture capital or whether it's some sort of private equity investment, they typically spend $1 to make two or three or five.
And that's
Uh,
it.
yeah. And so ownership structure really matters. I think you see this oftentimes in nonprofit corporations, not because nonprofits are, that the tax structure is, you know, uh, particularly that it's the tax structure itself is not like a moral imperative or something that supports good decisions or moral decisions. But what it does do is it takes pressure off the organization to generate profits for investors. And that's huge. So
Yeah.
you tend to see the kinds of decisions, not always, and oftentimes nonprofits struggle strategically, operationally. It's not where you go if you want to make a lot of money as an employee or a manager. But that structure takes the pressure off return on investment for investors. And so sometimes organizations with a nonprofit structure can be much closer, can really invest in purpose, can really invest in outcome, can really invest in mission without sort of paying the price that organizations or leaders might pay if they're accountable to investors.
Well, one of the problems with nonprofits, though, also is that all too often they approach it with the mindset, we're not able to make a lot of money. We're poor. We're a nonprofit.
Yeah.
We can't do that. And um, one of the debates I've had, and I worked for Guide Dogs for the Blind for a while and other
Yeah.
nonprofits, and one of the discussions I had was fundraising or development isn't really any different than sales. And of course, they try to make all sorts of arguments why it's different. But the reality is it's not. You're seeking money, you're trying to make a case for it. And um, when you have a mindset that no matter what you do, you can't make enough because we're a nonprofit. And the other part about it, I think it's changing a little bit with nonprofits. I know for a while, one of the things that I experienced was nonprofits couldn't have any kind of an administrative rate above 10%. People frowned on it if you were above 10%. And I saw one lecture from somebody, I think back in New York, who said he didn't buy into that. And he ran an organization for a while and spent more money than the 10% cap, but brought in a lot more money as well.
Right. Yeah, I think what you said is often very, very true with nonprofits. They can be sclerotic. And what I've seen, the models of nonprofits that I've seen be the most successful are nonprofits that still see themselves as a business, and they are very amenable to generating revenue from multiple sources.
Right.
Fundraising is just one.
Right.
If nonprofits that recognize, hey, there are multiple ways to generate revenue, multiple revenue streams, business lines that we can be in, and see that as ultimately as a way to resource their mission. That is a very different way of looking at how you operate as a nonprofit. And in fact, some of the most profitable organizations today are actually nonprofit, which sounds like an oxymoron, but it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Because nonprofit status is just a tax status.
Yeah.
And there are some other things that go with it, some other regulations about, community good and benefit and whatever. But some of the most profitable businesses in this country are nonprofit healthcare systems.
Right.
Or universities in,
Right.
At the very extreme end of exclusivity. And so it's possible to be very profitable In my state of Colorado, the UC health system has become just a juggernaut, absolute juggernaut. It's a multi-billion dollar a year operation as a nonprofit. They have a ravenous appetite for acquisition. um, they generate billions and billions of dollars in revenue in the business, and another half a billion or so in profit from their investments. And they provide a great service.
How do they treat their people?
So yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think you would get a different answer based upon whom you asked.
I'll bet.
And they've made some mistake. You know, they make many billions of dollars. They are about $1 billion ahead in profit each year on investments and their business, and yet, they're suing patients who can't pay their bill for small potatoes. Like, they sue patients for about 5 million a year, which is a rounding error in the P&L.
Yeah.
But devastating for the people getting sued.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't advocate that part of their business model, but they have been able to expand significant reach in their medical care to ever-growing numbers of people and really high-quality medical care by operating as a business, as a for-profit business that doesn't pay taxes.
Right.
Is the way I would describe it. So those models are out there too.
Yeah, it's an interesting world. Going back to our discussion about leadership, I know my philosophy is probably a little bit, at least on first appearance, contra to what you were talking about. I love having technical expertise. Having a master's degree in physics, when I started selling magnetic tape systems and so on, I learned all I could about how they worked, what to do with them. I became essentially an additional sales engineer, even though I was the Mid-Atlantic region sales manager for the company. But I knew all about the technology because I read all the bulletins that came out. I read all of the information, and I valued having that data. The reason, however, I valued having that data was because I knew that a number of the people who worked for me, like the salespeople, didn't pay attention to that. And the result is that many times things would come up that they wouldn't have answers to. And either they had to have a sales engineer come along, or they would get me to come along as their manager. And what I tried to instill in them was there is value in you having this information because it lends credibility. But there was another part about it for me, and I don't even remember when I started doing this, but when I began hiring people somewhere on the line, I would say, and I started saying to them, I know I hired you. I hired you because you sold me on the fact that you could sell our products, even though some were very exceptional compared to others. But I said, my job is not to be here to tell you what to do. My job is to sit down with you and figure out how I can add value to you to make you more successful. And so by that, I meant there are things you know, there are things I know, there are things that you do, there are things that I do. If you're smart, we figure out how I can augment you and deal with the things that you may not necessarily do well, that you can bring me in to help you with, to make you a more successful person in what you do, rather than me bossing you around. And only a few people really got that, but they were very successful at what they did.
Yeah, so I appreciate that you shared that, Michael. And here's what I would say about my comment about, technical skill versus success through others. What I'm suggesting is that, it can be very helpful for a leader to be highly skilled in some technical area.
Right.
Whatever that area is, that can be very helpful.
But
if that's how the leader believes he or she or they is going to bring value to the company,
I agree.
That's probably a mistake.
That's a problem.
Because that's a commodity that many people can share. And so, whereas success through others is recognizing that as an individual, you can only create a fraction of the value that many other people working together can create.
Right.
So there are, transactions, there are decisions where your technical skill can be really helpful,
Right.
in that process. But if your value add is going to come from technical skill, it's probably not value add.
Right. No,
Um,
the
yeah,
the the value add for me was knowing when to use the knowledge I have, and better yet, the salesperson knowing when to use the value add that I bring. And
right.
that's really the issue, is for them to do that, and for me to help teach them how to do that. And some of it was technical, and I value having a good technical skills. Sometimes I actually, over the phone, when we actually had some of our service people out on calls, they would call me and we talk about what's going on. And I might say something that suddenly gave them an idea that fixed the problem. And then they come dancing back in the office later, big heroes. But the issue isn't just that I had a technical knowledge. That's just one of the gifts that I had that I felt could be helpful. But the real value add that I bring is interacting with people and teaching them
Mhm.
what and how to use the different things that I might bring to what they do that they don't necessarily do. I had one guy who asked me, and he's my best sales guy, how come you know all this stuff and I don't? And I said, did you read the technical bulletin that came out last week? He said, no, I didn't have time. And I said, there you go. I said, I don't have access to anything that you don't have access to, but that's okay. But it would be good if you would learn more of that. And I think over time he took it to heart. But, again, for me also, very frankly, another skill that I brought was that I was blind. We went out on sales calls where we would go to meet, and a sales guy, my best sales guy, wanted me to go to a meeting with him, and they said that they wanted his manager to come, and he said, I didn't tell him you were blind. We walk in the room and hit him right between the eyes with this blind guy carrying a laptop projector and using a guide dog that they had no expectation was coming.
Mm.
And I did the PowerPoint presentation and other things like that they didn't expect. But that's the kind of value add, again, that I could bring. And actually, after the presentation was over, one of the people came up and he said, we're really ticked at you. And I said, why? And he said, well, typically these are very boring presentations, and yours wasn't, first of all. But more important, you never looked away. You could point over your shoulder and point right to the things that were on the screen. I knew how to do that. I had learned that. And you never looked at the screen. So we didn't even dare fall asleep because we forgot you were blind. I said, well, even if you had forgotten and fallen asleep, the dog's down here taking notes, so we would have got you anyway. But that's all part of the value add that I knew that I could bring that helped. And the result eventually was a sale that none of us knew about. But because we had developed that trust and shown that confidence on both of our parts, it worked out very well.
Yeah, and you made me think of something, and I'm not sure exactly what you said that made me think of this, but in terms of technical skill, I think there are some areas where technical skill is actually really helpful for a leader today. And one of those would be technical skill in leading change or change management.
Right.
And I think a lot of us just don't understand that is a skill, that there is a process, that there is a protocol. Yes, it's about attitude. Yes, it's about vision, no doubt, right? It's about communication. But successful change really almost always requires a purposeful process or protocol for implementing and leading that change. And very, very few leaders, shockingly few leaders, actually have any training or any in-depth skill in leading change itself, in the change management process, in how you do it from a nuts and bolts perspective. Which is really ironic, because if you think of the environment that most leaders operate in today. Those environments are incredibly ambiguous.
Yeah.
They are hyper change, both internal and external. And something you commit to and invest in and build out today might be barely relevant 18 months from now.
Yeah.
And yet, in the work that we do with leaders, it's incredibly rare that I come across a leader, maybe, and I'm not making this up, Michael, maybe 2 times in 50 do I come across a leader that can actually articulate a process for change that they understand, that they can implement, that they can leverage, that they're good at, which is really weird. I mean, I'm not sure what the analogy would be.
Yeah.
It might be, something like a pilot, or a chief pilot in an organization that just doesn't understand the new glass cockpit technology.
Yeah.
They just, they're comfortable with the round dials and the gauges and the pneumatics and the vacuum pumps, but they just don't get, the new stuff and how to train pilots on the new stuff. That was probably an inelegant
Well,
analogy.
maybe another one might be just the whole concept of AI. So many people fear AI,
Mhm.
but the reality is it can be an extremely powerful tool, and it can be a mechanism to help in all aspects of what we do. And I actually had a person on. His name is Glenn Gow, and he talks a lot about CEOs and dealing with corporate change, and is a very ardent supporter of AI. And one of the things that he says is, look, AI will not take away anyone's job. AI doesn't take them away. AI doesn't take the jobs away. It's people who take the jobs away and give them to AI without figuring out what to do with the people who they have. And the reality is AI isn't going to be able to do everything. And what we really need to do is to train people or provide other alternatives. And the example that he used was a truck driver. When we get to the point where we truly have autonomous driving and autonomous vehicles, what's the truck driver going to do? And a lot of people say, well, then they just don't need the truck driver anymore. And what he said was, and we both actually discussed it and I contributed to it, why not let the truck driver stay in the vehicle on principle, but give the truck driver other things to do for the company so that the truck driver keeps busy and does meaningful work while the vehicle itself is being driven, so that he is also there to help just in case something happens with the vehicle, but he's doing other things as well.
Yeah, our take on AI and the role it's going to play, or the implications it has for leadership, has evolved a little bit as well at the Transformation Collaborative. We initially were kind of the opinion that AI, I mean, we knew it was going to be a significant area of focus, let's just say that,
Yeah.
for leaders in organizations. But we initially thought, I think incorrectly, that it was going to be about, harnessing the technology itself,
Yeah.
about making really good decisions about employing the technology, determining, where, AI can bring value or efficiency, et cetera. And that's not untrue. But what we've come to believe is more likely to be true is going to be the role that leaders play in evaluating and understanding and taking advantage of the interface between human capital
Yep.
and technology, and figuring out how that human capital becomes more valuable and becomes more powerful in tandem with the technology.
One of the things that Glenn did was that he had someone that he worked with, a CEO of a company, and convinced him of the value of AI. And this guy called all of his direct reports in, and he said, I want you to take the rest of the day and look at AI, learn about it, and then by tomorrow, using AI, come up with ideas where AI can contribute to the company and where we can enhance what we do by using our skills and combining them with AI. And he said the next day he was totally blown away by the level of involvement that everybody brought during that previous day and the number of incredible ideas that people hadn't thought of before.
Yeah, and
It's all about the interface.
I'm not sure kind of where you want to go with
No, that's okay.
the conversation at this point, but one other thing that we have observed, and in fact, I just read a paper earlier this week, and I can't remember. I think it was written by AI researchers at Microsoft. I'd have to go find it. But it was a really interesting article. And I know it was also involved some folks at Stanford. I think there were 3 authors. And it was a really interesting take, which is they have come up with a new way of sort of measuring the effectiveness and capacity of AI. And that new way of measuring comes up with really different outcomes or really different assessments on what AI is capable of and sort of how it's progressing. And the short version is that AI is probably way, way less capable than we think it is, at least at this point. That
It's a tool.
really, it's
It's a
sheer
tool.
for, yeah, but and what they're saying is that the quote improvements or progress we're seeing now is not that it's actually getting smarter. It's not getting any more capable. That what we're doing is we're just through brute force, computing power and data sets, we are helping AI figure things out faster, make connections it didn't make before. But really, that's what's actually happening is, we're giving AI, 60 billion data points versus 10 billion.
But the other part about that is that AI in turn is feeding back to us things that help make us more creative.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, and I don't think they would disagree with that either. But I thought it was really interesting because it was the first time I saw that perspective, which is, hey, you know what? We may very well be attributing more capacity to AI than is really there.
Yeah.
At some point, we're going to run out of data points, and we're not, and we're going to hit a viable ceiling of computing power. And then what? It'll still do great things. It'll still do amazing things. It'll still be very helpful. But I guess the point was that the human element is probably going to continue to be more important than we were thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of merit to that. And, it goes back to the whole discussion with even the Gen Zers. I would suspect that even though they are, as you describe, if they found a company that truly demonstrated loyalty to them and truly wanted to make employees who come into the company a part of it and make them feel like they're a part of everything that goes on, that they, like in days of old, would want to stay there.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that one of the things that leaders and organizations are going to have to figure out is, and it's not rocket science.
No.
But they're going to have to break that code and figure out, because, human beings can only be seen as a line item on a P&L or can only be seen as efficiency plays for so long, if the downside is, 50% of your employees are totally disengaged or quiet quitting, or the turnover is, 25% a year, and you're spending double what you got in your efficiency by rehiring.
Yeah.
And by the way, that's not, particularly new or crazy or, creative thinking. That's just, pretty fundamental stuff.
We have a situation in California right now. In a sense, it's laughable, but I mean, it's not. But so on Monday, I think it is, the wage for fast food workers goes up to $20 an hour, which is $4 an hour more than the minimum wage in California. Okay, great. Fact. So that's going on. So prices are going to have to rise in various places, and they will. And yet people complain, well, the prices are going up and it's all the president's fault and all that. And you know, what I get so frustrated with are people who don't step back and analyze what's going on. Now, should we have raised the price to $20 an hour? I'm not the expert to say no to that, but I understand it. And I understand it's going to cause a change in price for fast food in places like McDonald's and other places like that. Is that a good thing? Well, it depends on who you are. For the fast food worker, it certainly is. And for the customer, they'll probably complain a lot.
I think it also depends, Michael, on the organization, on on their existing profit margins. For healthy organizations, for healthy, large, massive, at scale corporations, most of them can easily absorb those kinds of increase in labor cost if they are willing to take that increased cost out of things like shareholder dividends, executive bonuses, equity distributions. But that's really hard to do. Like, so if most of those very successful, profitable organizations have the resources, absolutely. What they may not have is the resources to more fairly compensate employees and maintain the same levels of profitability.
Yeah.
And so that, where, you see that thinking where you see, massive, oftentimes multinational corporations that have multi-billion-dollar profits, and they will lay off thousands of employees, not because they have a cash flow problem, not because they have a profitability problem, but because they want to preemptively preserve profit margins or shareholder dividends at a given level through maybe a slower sales cycle or something like that. And when you are in a capitalist system and the primary focus of investor supported companies, there is a tremendous amount of pressure, way more pressure, to preserve the shareholder dividend than to support a higher wage for employees, particularly lower end employees. And we'll see what happens in California. I know so far in many places, there's almost never evidence to support the doom and gloom. That tons of people will be laid off, that customers won't buy, that organizations will go bankrupt. Some of that happens, for organizations on the margins, but this happens over and over at Washington, D.C., Seattle, California, New York City. And these are not all, necessarily ideal or perfect situations, but the doom and gloom almost never, ever happens.
Yeah. The world isn't going to come to an end. Of course, looking at it from the standpoint of when we grew up, so these people are now going to make $40,000 a year, which is a fair amount of money, but the other side of it is I don't even know what the number is today. What's the poverty level in the United States? It isn't that much lower than that.
Yeah, and I think it depends on how you measure it. So,
That's
there's
true.
measures, there are federal numbers, there are state numbers, there are thresholds for things like Medicaid or
Yeah.
SNAP benefits, what we used to call food stamps.
Food
There are all
stamps. Yeah.
different ways to look at it. But um, and I don't have the data in front of me, but the combination of stagnant wages and then the double hit recently of inflation,
Yeah.
um, the buying power for a really substantial slice of people in this country, workers in this country, um, had incredible downward pressure. Um, there was a brief moment of reprieve, which is mostly federal money during COVID.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I mean, if you look at over the last 30 years where buying power has increased, it's been almost exclusively in the upper echelons, top 20%
Yeah.
of wage earners. And the bottom 80 have been mostly flat for about the last 30 years. So, the idea that, I mean, $20 an hour sounds like a lot, for a fast food worker. And it probably would have been a lot, 10 years ago.
10 years ago. Yeah. That's
But,
my point.
but relative to cost of living, it's only marginally greater than the increases in cost of living over the same time.
Right. That's the point.
Yeah.
And people can complain about it and grouse all they want, but the reality is, I'd love to hear what you think when it suddenly becomes your son or your daughter who's going to work at McDonald's to start to earn a living. The reality is it isn't that much. One of the things that I really changing the subject on you a little bit that I've always found fascinating. I've had the opportunity to travel to other countries and speak and so on. Speaking of restaurants and so on, is the whole concept of tipping, because there you really only tip if it's an incredibly exceptionally good job. And a lot of times I thought people did an exceptionally good job and they wouldn't let me tip them. They wouldn't take my money. Well, we didn't do that great of a job. I thought they did for my own personal reasons as to why. But here, it's unfortunate. All it's doing is kind of giving things to the workers and making it an excuse for the employers not to pay them.
Yeah, well, I've also had the great fortune of traveling and living abroad quite a bit. I think 39 countries I've visited, and I've lived in 6. And I think that dynamic you're describing, particularly as it applies to the United States, is both economic and cultural.
Yeah.
And on the economic side, and one could also argue this is another kind of manifestation of late stage capitalism. The push for profits, the push for enrichment has to come from somewhere. The pie doesn't grow as fast as the enrichment and the profits do. So it has to come from somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And, this started some years ago, when companies started to unload benefits, the cost of benefits. And, there are many, many companies out there. Walmart is probably one of the largest employers. A substantial percentage of its employees qualify for Medicaid. And that's where they're full-time employees, and yet they get their health care from the federal government.
Yeah.
And taxpayers. That is a tool that allows that business to shift expense from the company to the public. So that's one example. Another example is with the tipping issue. You've got more and more and more companies that were where employees were falling further and further behind in terms of buying power based upon what they were being paid. And so to fill that gap, it was shifted to consumers, to customers. I'll tell you a funny story. I was, and it's like, there seems to be no end in sight. And I've read a couple articles, one in the New York Times, one in the Washington Post. I'm sorry, I mean, Wall Street Journal, about the tipping backlash.
Oh.
and how customers are just getting fed up. I was in a bookstore, Michael, about, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I bought a book I wanted, and I, purposely went to a local bookstore, to give them my business. And I went to pay for the book, and that damn screen popped up, do you want to
You
tip
want a tip?
80%,
Yeah.
20%, 22%? I'm thinking, wait, I'm buying a book, you know, in a bookstore.
Yeah.
Um, and it was irritating. It was a dilemma. And I thought, well, if I'm the person selling the book, and I don't know what those people make per hour, um, but a tip probably is helpful to them. It probably, if it goes to them. Um, but I just remember thinking, yeah, this is nutty, right? I mean, at some point, there's a wage that you can live on for doing your job, and uh, and we've just shifted it. It used to be that tipping was in very few places.
Yeah.
A restaurant, a bar, an intense service transaction, right? Bringing up a book that I pulled off the shelf is not an intense service
No,
interaction.
I've not been above asking, do you get the tip? And
Well, I've done that too. Yeah,
and I
yeah,
respond accordingly as far as tipping when that happens.
yeah, yeah. And sometimes it doesn't even go to the employee, which is shocking.
No, yeah, and that's disgusting. Um, that's just not an acceptable thing, but it does happen. It's so strange that we have some of these things. Well, we are in a and all the things we've been talking about contribute to it, but there's so much polarization
Yeah,
in this country right now, and you got the people who will say, well, fast food and food prices are on the rise. They're going way up. And there's a lot of evidence that they're not really going up in grocery stores and stuff as much as people want to make it believe. But there's a segment of society that says how much it's going up. Nobody discusses how the pandemic contributed to all that. But then there are other people who say, wait a minute, inflation really is going down and it's not really what people say. How do we really deal with this whole polarization issue, or can we?
yeah. Well, and maybe that's kind of a topic to wrap up on. I have a stop here in a few minutes, but um, so this is a really interesting and I think really, really important question, Michael, because that polarization, that tribalism, whatever the issue is, right? And it seems to be an equal opportunity employer. The
Yeah.
polarization, the
Yeah.
tribalism, it can apply to anything. I think it's a really, really corrosive element in society right now.
Yeah.
Um, I know we all sort of intuitively feel it is a big deal, and it makes a lot of us uncomfortable. And but I don't think that broadly we recognize just how corrosive it is, just how potentially
Yeah.
dangerous it is. Um, so I have and you talked about, I have this long and winding career. One of the things I'm doing now and I've been doing for a while is working as a mental health counselor, as a psychotherapist. And so I have a lot of interest in psychology and social psychology, and I see a lot of clients whose distress is not just about their own issues. It's about climate change. It's about polarization. It's about tribalism. It's about,
Yeah.
racism. It's about, all of these things that are going on externally that they, technically have no control over. And it can really exacerbate their depression, their anxiety, whatever they would bring to the table, regardless.
Right.
And I think what's going on here, and this is not just me. I mean, I've read some interesting theories on this, but that polarization is almost certainly tied more to a need for belonging, a need for acceptance in a group,
Mm-hmm.
than it has anything to do with ideology or politics or policy or whatever. That But politicians have taken advantage of it. They've
Yeah.
leveraged it. They've uh, flamed. They've added fuel to the fire. Um, but this idea that, and I think the theory really is pretty solid. I mean, to the extent that people will even vote against their own interests pretty substantially,
Yeah.
like people on Medicaid or Medicare voting for a candidate who wants to eliminate Medicaid or Medicare,
Yeah.
or in a state, that doesn't want to expand Medicaid and they're poor and that's their insurance or would be their insurance, really crazy, weird stuff. But the theory is that it's more important, it feels better, it feels safer
Yeah. To belong.
to belong, to have a tribe, than it is and to the extent that people will very quickly and easily, ignore arguments, facts, reality, that could challenge their affiliation with whatever tribe they're affiliating with. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
Well, and the problem is that what we don't learn, we want this sense of belonging, but we don't really think a lot about how to maybe pick the tribe that really, or the group that really would be best for our interests. And there's so much fear in the world that we just don't tend to want to deal with that.
Yeah, and it's not rational. It's not
No, it's not.
Let me rephrase that. It's very rational in the sense of finding belonging or finding acceptance
Sure,
or
but
finding social connection. It's not rational in terms of one's own interests.
one of the things that I did early in the era of the pandemic was to start to realize that for years I had talked about not being afraid leaving the World Trade Center, but never really discussed teaching people how to learn to control fear. And I've now written a book that'll be published in August called Live Like a Guide Dog, true stories from a blind man and his dogs about being brave, overcoming adversity, and moving forward in faith. And it's all about teaching people to learn to control fear. And you pointed it out. The fact is there are a lot of things that we can't control necessarily that happen to us, but we always can control how we deal with what happens to us.
Yeah, yeah.
If we want to learn that.
And part of a real prominent therapeutic intervention called cognitive behavior therapy. That's a real big part of that. It's been a pleasure talking to you again,
Yeah,
Michael.
it has, and I want to thank you for. You have to go, and I want to thank you for being here and being part of Unstoppable Mindset again. Love to hear from you all what you think of Wallace being here and his thoughts. And either we'll have to do it again, but Wallace, if you know of other people who ought to be on the podcast, we sure would appreciate introductions.
Absolutely. It's been great, Michael. Thanks so much for the time and for the platform just to have a nice, enjoyable conversation.